Let's dive right into this explainer. Today we're unpacking a story that completely flips how we think about corporate power. We're talking about an unbelievable true story of a historical megacorporation, the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC as it's widely known. This thing grew so incredibly massive, it actually became more powerful than many sovereign nations.
I mean, just imagine waking up tomorrow morning and discovering that a single, solitary business controls almost every product you buy. And not just that, they completely control the global shipping routes crossing the oceans, and, incredibly, they command actual armies with the power to wage war. Like, how would you even begin to wrap your head around that level of dominance?
It sounds totally like science fiction, right? You'd honestly expect to see this in some dystopian movie script. But this totally shatters our modern assumptions, because centuries ago, this wasn't fiction at all. It was reality. This is the very real, super dramatic history of an empire built entirely on the global spice trade. And, spoiler alert, it's also the story of how immense greed eventually destroyed everything that early success had built.
All right, let's get into part one, Birth of a Giant, the Opportunity.
So, every empire begins with an opportunity, right? Back in the early 1600s, Europe developed an absolute obsession with goods from distant lands in Asia. We're talking rare spices, nutmeg, mace, cloves, black pepper. And back then, these weren't just, simple flavorings. They were heavily relied upon for preserving meat and quickly became the ultimate status symbol. Nutmeg was literally worth more than its weight in gold. The demand just completely exploded. But instead of standard, localized merchants competing fairly and taking on the massive financial and physical risks of sailing all the way to Indonesia alone, powerful investors realized something huge. Whoever controlled these routes permanently would be unimaginably rich. So in 1602, they joined forces to create something the world had never seen before, a government-backed monopoly actually capable of using military force.
Suddenly, trade was no longer just business. Unlike any normal company, this corporation was granted unprecedented authority by the Dutch government. Trade had transformed into pure politics, power, and empire building. The VOC literally bypassed governments to negotiate their own international treaties with local rulers in Asia. They minted their own coins. They built their own heavily fortified military bases, like the sprawling city of Batavia, which is modern-day Jakarta. They raised private armies made up of thousands of mercenaries, and they aggressively defended their corporate interests with brutal military force. This was a completely new breed of power that totally blurred the line between a business and a nation-state.
Which brings us to part two, politics, power, and empire. The peak.
Now, this incredible dominance definitely didn't happen overnight. It was a rapid, escalating timeline. It started with that initial massive explosion of consumer demand, which led powerful investors to consolidate their resources. And that directly put massive, heavily armed fleets of East Indiaman ships across the oceans. Keep in mind, these ships were carrying absolute fortunes in cargo, silks, porcelain, and literally tons of invaluable spices. This step-by-step progression resulted in the birth of a terrifyingly efficient, highly lucrative global monopoly that essentially locked out all European competitors from the Indonesian archipelago for decades.
And the sheer scale of this monopoly brought massive wealth, and not just to the shareholders, but to entire societies. Global ports rapidly expanded just to accommodate their massive 1,000-ton ships. The city of Amsterdam became incredibly wealthy off the flow of trade, even establishing the very first modern stock exchange just to trade shares of this specific company. For nearly 2 centuries, the strategy seemed absolutely flawless. At its peak, the VOC paid out annual dividends of 18% to its investors and employed nearly 50,000 people. I mean, this corporate giant looked stronger than ever, and to the rest of the world, they appeared completely unstoppable.
But moving on to part 3, the illusion of success, the rot.
See, this unimaginable success created a dangerous illusion. Because they were so dominant, the leaders of this megacorporation became dangerously convinced that they were, invincible. Instead of actually outperforming their rivals through better products, innovation, or, smarter business practices, they believed they could simply use their vast military power to eliminate any competition entirely.
Profit essentially became more important than people, and entire markets turned into forced monopolies. What should have been standard business negotiation became flat-out intimidation and, in a lot of cases, outright violence. And as this happened, a deep internal decay set in. The company notoriously underpaid its standard employees, which meant corruption spread like wildfire throughout the ranks. Officials started illegally trading on the side, prioritizing their own personal wealth and greed over the long-term success of the company. It was a massive internal smuggling problem. And those massive private armies and forts we talked about earlier,
Well, maintaining dozens of warships and thousands of soldiers meant engaging in increasingly expensive wars just to keep the monopoly intact. So suddenly, the operational costs were skyrocketing, literally eating away at the profits from the inside out.
Let's look at part 4, corruption and collapse, the inevitable fall.
The scales finally tipped. On one side, the giant made fatal mistakes. They were suffering from rapidly rising operational costs from those endless wars, and deep corporate corruption was completely hollowing them out from the inside. The administrative bloat was just massive. In response, the rest of the world didn't just sit by. As the giants stumbled, the unique advantages that once guaranteed their dominance began disappearing. Competitors, like the British East India Company, actually learned from these mistakes. They ran leaner operations and quickly developed entirely new trade networks to compete. Even worse for the Dutch giant, global consumer tastes changed. The world started demanding tea, coffee, and cotton, markets where the British were much faster to adapt, while the VOC was stuck paying for an absurdly expensive military just to protect a shrinking, outdated spice monopoly. The world adapted, while the giant decayed.
So the monopoly slowly, inevitably collapsed. Investors who had once celebrated what they thought was a total guarantee of endless growth were forced to watch their vast fortunes completely disappear as debts mounted into the tens of millions of guilders. Finally, on December 31st, 1799, the bankrupt company was officially nationalized and dissolved. This monumental corporation that had literally shaped global trade, pioneered the stock market, and acted as a sovereign nation for nearly 200 years just vanished into history.
And that brings us to our final section, part 5, preview of the future, the ultimate lesson.
The core takeaway from all of this source material is incredibly simple, but absolutely crucial. Power without accountability rarely lasts. The dramatic history of this company repeatedly reminds us that no empire, whether it's a sprawling political body or a massive corporate entity, is immune to destruction from its own greed, bloat, and refusal to adapt. Let it really sink in. Absolutely no empire is too big to fail. Because history isn't just about dusty textbooks and the distant past, right? It's very often a direct preview of the future. So, I'll leave you to consider this. As we look at today's modern corporate landscape, with its own massive tech giants and global monopolies wielding unprecedented influence over our daily lives, are we watching this exact cycle repeat itself? Who is building the next empire right now? And will they learn the lesson, or are they destined to share the exact same fate?